It's been nearly 1 month since P. Diddy was arrested and slammed with some pretty severe federal charges. That also means he spent almost 30 days behind bars at one of the most notorious jails in the country. So what does life look like on the inside for a Grammy award-winning celebrity? Is P. Diddy getting any special treatment? And could the rumors be true that he's fearful for his life, that someone may attack or poison him? We're breaking it all down with DeWayne Hendrix, who spent years as the deputy warden at Brooklyn's Metropolitan Detention Center, the same jail where Diddy now sits. I'm Gillespie, and this is Law&Crime News. The lavish life of 54-year-old Sean P. Diddy Combs took a detour last month when he was indicted by a grand jury on multiple federal charges. He was arrested in New York on charges of racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and transportation to engage in prostitution. The 14-page indictment lays out some pretty strong claims against Diddy, alleging he's guilty of sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The indictment goes on to allege Diddy showed a pattern of abuse, mostly against women, that included verbal, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, including the use of extensive grooming tactics. There's also mention of something referred to as freak-offs, which are described as elaborate and produced sex performances that Combs arranged, directed, masturbated during, and often electronically recorded. During these so-called freak-offs, Diddy would often drug his victims, sometimes without their knowledge, to keep them both obedient and compliant. Then, Diddy allegedly required these victims to have sex with prostitutes, and oftentimes he recorded it. Again, the recordings were made without the victim's knowledge or consent. But this federal indictment isn't the first time we've heard these harrowing accusations. The bombshells were first dropped by Cassandra Ventura, or the singer Cassie. She filed civil suit last November. Cassie and Diddy had dated for years, and during that time, Cassie says Diddy physically, emotionally, and sexually abused her. Hey, listen up. I have something you're not going to want to miss. Today, Upside is sponsoring Law&Crime's YouTube takeover, and here's what you get out of it. Free cash. Seriously, you just download the app and the money can get transferred straight into your bank account. I've started using it on things like filling up my gas, which normally I'm not super passionate about, but this makes it a lot more enjoyable. All you have to do is download the app, pay as usual with credit or debit, and then follow the steps in the app to get paid. To find out how much you could earn, click the link in the description to download Upside, or scan the QR code on the screen and use our promo code LCTakeover and get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. Cassie's lawsuit was settled just 1 day after it was filed, but it was too late. Since then, a dozen more civil suits have been filed against Diddy, all citing the same pattern of coercion and abuse. And the accusations aren't slowing down. Just this month, Houston-based attorney Tony Busby announced plans to file an additional 120 civil lawsuits against Diddy over the next 30 days. These future lawsuits describe multiple new allegations, including violent sexual assault or rape, sexual abuse, facilitating sex with controlled substances, false imprisonment, compelling prostitution, sexual misconduct, dissemination of video recordings, and sexual abuse of minors. Now, according to Busby, there are a handful of accusers who were allegedly abused as minors, one person as young as 9 years old. Since news of these lawsuits broke, Busby reports receiving upwards of 12,000 new calls, reporting even more abuse at the hands of Diddy. But he's not the only one being called out. Busby says other high-profile celebrities were involved in these alleged assaults, saying specifically, the names will shock you. These celebrities will likely be listed in the upcoming lawsuits, though there are reports that some have already settled outside of court to avoid having their names be made public. There are other reports, though, that at least one A-list celebrity is caught on video in a recording of a freak-off, and apparently that celebrity is clearly identifiable. Who those other celebrities could be, or to what extent they were involved in Diddy's alleged scheme, that remains to be seen, as right now Diddy is the only one charged. And with those charges came a trip to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, where Diddy's been held since mid-September. He pleaded not guilty to the charges and was twice denied bail. His legal team offered a pretty sizable bail package, too, saying that Diddy would put up $50 million for his release. This would have been co-signed by Diddy, his sister, his mom, his 3 adult sons, and the mothers of 2 of his children. The defense also suggested that Diddy would have major restrictions on travel, also a GPS monitor, and even limitations on female visitors. Diddy's bail request was denied, though, by 2 separate judges who ruled the bail package was insufficient to guarantee the safety of the community or to avoid witness tampering. Diddy's team has since filed an appeal and is now working on their 3rd attempt for Diddy's release. Much of this has to do with MDC, as Diddy's attorney Mark Agnifilo argues there are major issues with the jail, citing violence, poor conditions, overcrowding, and staffing issues. He also cited some startling statistics. 2 inmates have been killed at MDC since June of this year, and at least 4 inmates have died by suicide over the past 3 years. On top of all that, 6 staff members have been charged with crimes over the past 5 years. Even so, it's common for defendants to be housed at MDC after their arrest, as they're awaiting trial in either Manhattan or Brooklyn. But the issues at MDC are so severe that some judges even refuse to send their defendants there at all. But Diddy isn't the first high-profile inmate to walk the halls of MDC. It previously housed R. Kelly, Ghislaine Maxwell, and Sam Bankman-Fried, who's actually there right now. Bankman-Fried was convicted of fraud and money laundering last November after the collapse of his cryptocurrency exchange, FTX. And as it happens, Bankman-Fried and Diddy are being housed in the same part of MDC, a unit for inmates that require special protection. That's people like Diddy or Bankman-Fried who are high-profile names. Or it also houses other people who need protection during ongoing investigations. When Diddy arrived at MDC, he was initially placed on suicide watch, meaning he had round-the-clock supervision. He's no longer considered a threat in that way, but he's still under close watch from MDC staff. And who better to tell us about Diddy's life on the inside than a veteran MDC deputy warden? That's Dr. DeWayne Hendrix, who held that title at MDC from 2013 to 2016. On top of that, he previously worked as a senior warden with the U.S. Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Prisons. But let's start with life at MDC. Just talking about MDC in general, the Metropolitan Detention Center, a lot of people are talking about the conditions of it. Some people, Diddy's attorneys, calling it deplorable. What do you think? Was it really deplorable?
No, I will say I worked at MDC Brooklyn as an associate warden from the years of 2013 to 2016. There are some challenges with any prison or jail facility to run, and I won't say that MDC Brooklyn doesn't has had its challenges in the past since its activation in 1993. And when I was there, there were some challenges in terms of sanitation and other operational procedures. However, I will say during the latter part of my tenure, the institution did improve on many areas to include sanitation, and more specifically as it relates to our relationships with our stakeholders, more specifically our public defender's office and the judicial districts of the Eastern District of New York and Brooklyn, as well as our Southern District of New York partners with the U.S. Attorney's offices and the judges' offices. So, but yeah, they've had some significant challenges, but they've also housed some of the most notorious terrorists, drug lords, and other folks who are facing high-level crimes. So again, there have been challenges, and there will continue to be challenges there. But when it comes down to taking care of business and keeping people safe, I will say that they've done a great job at doing that over the years.
Besides the conditions, talking about the safety of people, that's something that P. Diddy's lawyers have highlighted, saying that in the past there have been suicides there, some murders. Apparently, some corrections officers have been charged criminally. What would you say? Is it a safe place to be for these inmates?
Overall, I would say yes. Throughout the history of corrections and jail operations, there have been suicides and homicides. I will say, as a deputy warden there, I did experience inmate suicide while I was there as acting warden. And unfortunately, pretrial detention can be some of the most tumultuous periods of time for people while they're incarcerated, because one, they are there for alleged crimes that haven't been convicted yet. So some of them are, have suicidal ideation as soon as they get there, or periods of time while they are there, because they may be facing several years in prison, and some unfortunately that has happened in the past. And in terms of homicides, unfortunately, those things do happen in jails and in prisons. But I wouldn't say that it happens there more often than any other jail or prison that houses several thousands inmates. So I'll say when I was my tenure there, we were fluctuating between 2,700 and 3,000 offenders awaiting trial.
Going off what you were talking about, homicide and suicide, the suicide half of things is what I want to focus on. Obviously, very devastating for the people, the families who are going through it. But the reason that we're talking about it now is P. Diddy was actually placed on suicide watch when he first arrived at MDC. And I'm wondering why that may be. Is it because he did have suicidal ideations, or was it just kind of a precaution thing?
Well, no one is ever placed on suicide as a precaution. However, like you said, I mean, you're talking about an individual who probably, I'm not sure if he has any prior criminal history or any other periods of time incarcerated, which means his movements is restricted. And you go from, very large mansions where you have staff and personal chefs and, people who work for you are there available to you to get you all the things that you want and desire and need on a day-to-day basis. And then all of a sudden, now your movements are restricted, and you're placed in a 6'8" by 8 feet cell, and you're probably going to be secure in that cell 23 hours a day. And then when you do move out, whether it's for medical treatment or recreation time, he's probably going to have 3 staff members with him, and he'll be in handcuffs. So the sheer shock of being in that predicament, and then the charges that he's facing, that could have taken a quick mental toll on him. And when clinicians place someone on suicide watch, whether it's verbal, written, or physical attributes of presenting yourself as suicidal, that individual will be placed on suicide watch. They'll be given a smock to cover their body, a blanket, and depending on their history of potential suicide risk, if they've had attempts in the past, specifically for hanging, they may or may not be giving undergarments to include underwear and socks. So again, it's not unusual for a person to maybe show signs of suicidal ideation, especially when you're facing these type of charges and never having your movements restricted, especially when you're a high profile individual as him.
So it's possible then that with Diddy on suicide watch, he wasn't in a traditional jumpsuit or anything, but it was more like a smock and he didn't have access to other things in his cell. Is that right?
No, other than maybe food items that would be brought to him. And then obviously he'd be under 24-hour supervision, observation, so to speak. Would have had several visits from a psychologist or a clinician coming to check on him at least once every several hours, and having those conversations with him to see how he's feeling, what kind of mood he's in. And then he would have been taken off suicide watch after the psychologist felt that he was no longer a threat to himself, for self-harm rather.
What we also know about Diddy's stay at MDC is that he's in a protective care unit for his own safety. So that's different than general population. Can you explain that a bit to me?
Okay, so when you talk about what we normally call special housing unit, so there's 2 types of detention in terms of being in special housing. One is administrative detention, and I'll go back to that point here in a second, and then disciplinary segregation. Disciplinary segregation is for individuals who have been went through a disciplinary process for an infraction of the rules and regulations of the institution, whether it be in a fight or any other acts that go against the policies of the institution, the orderly and safe running of the institution, and that is for a specific period of time. What Mr. Combs may be in as far as administrative detention is when someone is under investigation for a possible infraction against the rules of the institution, or they could be in protective custody because they may fear of their life, which is a question may have been, well, probably would have been asked of him once he was in his intake process. Uh, Additionally, we're talking about someone who was high profile, who was just arrested here less than 3 weeks ago. So in terms of who are the other inmates in the institution that may or may not be someone who could be a threat towards him, in terms of the possible alleged victims, could they have ties to the victims, in terms of his discovery that he's going to need to look at with his attorney. Inmates are allowed to have a certain amount of legal materials in their cell, and all this alleged discovery that he's going to have to go through. You don't want to have anyone have other inmates having access to his cell to go in and take a look at that discovery, because there's a certain amount of legal materials that each inmate is allowed to have in their cell. So there's several factors that come into play when it comes to administrative detention. And more than likely, the agency has the rights and duties and privileges as holding persons under the custody of the U.S. Attorney General to run a safe and humane institution, and whatever is necessary to be done to maintain the safety of the facility and those in their custody and care, they will do that. So I would believe that he is in administrative detention, even if it's not in the specific special housing unit. It could be another area within the facility that they have space. There's over 1 million square foot of space between the east and the west buildings there in Brooklyn. So I'm sure he's there being monitored, by a couple of different staff. And the only staff that probably would have access to him will be those on a need to see him and talk to him on a daily basis, like the leadership of the institution, the security, chief of security, clinical staff, whether it's medical or mental health, and those case managers, counselors that are specifically there to make sure that his visiting list is up to date, or any other things that he needs in terms of his stay there is done. So that will be the type of administrative detention that he's probably under at this time.
You laid out a couple of different reasons why someone would be in that specific unit. And I'm wondering about Diddy specifically. Do you think it's all of those things you listed, in addition to his high profile name, his celeb name, but possibly that if he was transferred to general population, that he would be in immediate danger, that somebody would attack him or even try to kill him?
No, I wouldn't, so to speak, think that he would be in immediate danger, but due to the high profile nature of his case, and again the different discoveries and all the other information that may come with it, you don't want to take that risk. So at some point, he may be able to go to a general population unit, and I can tell you it'll probably be more of a specialized general population unit with, based on the type of crimes that he is charged with. He would probably be housed with those type of individuals at that point when they deem it necessary, or they can honestly feel like that he could be safe in that environment. So at some point, he may be able to go to a specialized general population unit. But I'll tell you, because there's so much fluidity with this case and all the different allegations, which align with someone like a Ghislaine Maxwell. And then, of course, the agency learned some really tough lessons after the suicide of Mr. Epstein at MCC New York.
Moving on to talk about the specific cell that Diddy is in. Obviously, I know that you haven't been there to see it, but just hypothesizing based on your familiarity with MDC. You mentioned 6x8 cell. What else is there? I mean, for those of us who are visualizing it, who haven't been inside, what would it look like?
So it would have a bunk bed style. So you'd have two beds on a bunk, and then they'll have a one flat mattress on both bunks, depending on if he has a cellmate. I'm not sure if he does or not. There is a desk, a small desk, a little chair, a sink, and also a toilet. And then there's typically a small mirror, not necessarily glass, but there's something in there so that way you can have a reflection of yourself in terms of grooming on a day-to-day basis.
There have been some reports that Diddy has gotten quote unquote special treatment in the way that he's gotten different food than other inmates or more shower time, perhaps. Do you think any of that has any merit?
Well, I would ordinarily I would say no. He would not be getting any special food because when you're talking about a jail operation with thousands of inmates, the food is actually prepped 3 days in advance because the food is actually cooked in one area, then they're boxed up and put on carts and then moved to eat to the various units in the east and west building. So I would say no. Now, in terms of if he's not a like a meat eater, there's what we call a common fare, where they have vegan and vegetarian options and that nature. But no, he would not be receiving any special diet or meal. There's a national menu that each institution has to go with, and there's no specific special meals for any, in particular, any incarcerated person in the jail.
So, what would a normal meal look like? Just an example of one.
Okay, so today is Wednesday. So at lunch, every Wednesday they call it Burger Day. So he'd have a burger and fries and maybe a small little salad and fruit if he's a flesh eater. But if he's not, he'd get something like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, also with some different fruit or some small vegetable options. So that would be an example of a meal that he would have on today.
A lot of people are talking about the food because it's just interesting to see Diddy go from these likely private chefs to now this food at MDC. But there have also been reports that he hasn't been eating as much because he was nervous that someone could have poisoned his food. What do you think about that? Is that even possible?
Well, anything is possible, but it's highly improbable. I will say that because again, the meals are cooked 3 days in advance, and there's no specific signage on each meal that goes to the various units that, hey, this is the meal that this particular person is going to get. I will say that the incarcerated individuals are the ones who actually cook the meals. They are highly trained by food service professionals, corrections professionals. There are thousands upon thousands of meals that are cooked in prisons every day, and from my experience, rarely seen inmates get ill from the meals, let alone the possibility of being poisoned. But I will say this in terms of this news coming out when he initially arrived. Again, if there are allegations that he's been on drugs and some other things, so maybe this is just some sort of process that he may be going through, withdrawals or anything like that, in terms of trying really, I call being in jail the ultimate timeout. So now he's had some time to really reflect on some of these allegations. So if this is true that he is thinking in this framework, it's probably because he's going through some mental crisis, and hopefully those staff, and I know those clinicians there, they'll be able to help him get through that process if he's willing to listen and engage with the clinical professionals there.
So we've talked about Diddy's cell, what it looks like, and potentially some of the meals that he has. But what about his day to day? You said about 23 hours a day are spent inside the cell. But what would a normal day for him look like in this protective care unit?
So the lights would go out. I'll just start in the evening before. So the lights would probably go out about 10 o'clock, somewhere around that time. And then he'd wake up in the morning. But he's counted 5 times a day. So every night, starting at midnight, 3 a.m., 5 a.m. on weekends and holidays, there's a 10 a.m. stand-up count. And then there's a standard 4 p.m. stand-up count every day. And then there's an evening count, but anywhere between 8 and 10 p.m. Each day that he'd be accounted for. Lights would normally come on around 6. He'd be offered a breakfast meal. He would engage in conversations with the staff. I mean, if he's on any sort of medication, he'd have pill line. But even if he's not on medication, a medical clinician, he'll see one of those on a daily basis. He'll have an opportunity to shower. If there's not a shower within that cell that he's in, have a possibility to go to a shower, just like any other inmate. And then he'd also, get his lunch, and then he'd talk, possibly have a conversation with, someone on the leadership team or whoever's there for his enhanced operations if he needs writing materials to write his family. I know he would have the possibility of obviously connecting with his attorney through legal visits, whether it's video visiting or visiting with his attorney in person. And also, he probably have the possibility to meet with his family probably on a weekly basis in the visiting room if they're allowing him to either do video visiting or in-person visiting. So, but and then he'd probably have an opportunity to do 1 hour recreation time. And then again, if he's, has any medical issues that require him to leave the cell, then obviously at that point, he'd have the opportunity to leave the cell. But again, he'd probably have at least 3 to 4 staff members with him at all times when he leaves that cell.
An example of when he's leaving the cell could be when he is going to a court appearance. For instance, we have one this week. You said 3 to 4 people would be with him, but what would it look like then? Obviously, he's probably going to change into a suit or some sort of street clothes as opposed to this smock or the jumpsuit. But what would the rest of it look like transporting him to the court?
Well, I mean, just being in a metropolitan detention center, hundreds of inmates move out to go to court on a daily basis. They would move him to the receiving and discharge area. At that point, he'd be out processed. The marshals or whoever is responsible for bringing him over to the court would arrive at the facility at a specific time. They would then take custody of him and move him over to the courthouse. And at that point, I think he would be able to, in one of their lockups over at the courthouse, he'd have the opportunity to change into whatever garments that he would wear for his court appearances. And they'd keep him there for a specific amount of time throughout the day. And then they'd bring him back to the institution. He'd be in processed again. And then he'd be taken back to the area that he is being housed in Brooklyn.
Now, P. Diddy, news of his alleged crimes have really shed a light on MDC. But in general, MDC is no stranger to some high profile inmates. I mean, there was Ghislaine Maxwell, R. Kelly. What can you tell me about their time being housed there and how that would relate to Diddy's time there?
Well, I can tell you, as a parallel to Mr. Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, there were, agency learned a lot of hard lessons after that unfortunate incident at MCC New York. So, she probably had the same enhanced operations that I mentioned about Diddy, Mr. Combs, in terms of having, being in a specific area in administrative detention with enhanced operations, with staff would be there to make sure that anytime that she moved out of that cell, that there are several people with her in terms of, making sure no one is allegedly sleeping on the job or, searching the internet while something bad could be happening, especially with a case that's very similar to what Mr. Combs is facing. Now, in terms of R. Kelly, I know to my knowledge, he was in administrative detention for a specific period of time. And then he was moved to a more a general population, but it was more specialized. And from what I understand, there were no issues that came out of his time at MDC Brooklyn until he was convicted and moved to his designated facility where he's doing his time at now.
We know that P. Diddy has been charged. He's the only defendant in the case as of right now, but there have been rumblings that some other high profile celebrities or A-listers are involved, and maybe they could be charged too. So, what happens then if these people are arrested and charged with these federal crimes and they're sent to MDC? What would that look like?
Well, that would pose somewhat of a challenge depending on the person that will be charged and whether they're as high profile as Mr. Combs or even higher profile. It would definitely stretch their resources because MCC New York is no longer operational at this time. So it would definitely pose some operational challenges to the agency, which will have them really having some high level discussions as to where these individuals would be housed. So they would be close enough to be able to see their attorneys if they're hiring someone in the New York area, and being able to go through that discovery process and then be able to make it to court, when those court dates come up. So it will definitely pose some different challenges because, as we know, Ms. Maxwell didn't get arrested for those charges until after Mr. Epstein had passed away. And someone, we're talking about somebody like R. Kelly. He didn't have any co-defendants, and currently Mr. Combe does not. So it will definitely pose some challenges to the resources to their operations.
As for Diddy's side of things, his team released a statement after his arrest, reading in part, quote, "Sean Diddy Combs is a music icon, self-made entrepreneur, loving family man, and proven philanthropist who has spent the last 30 years building an empire, adoring his children, and working to uplift the Black community. He is an imperfect person, but is not criminal. Please reserve your judgment until you have all the facts. These are the acts of an innocent man with nothing to hide, and he looks forward to clearing his name in court." For Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.